Welcome to Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival 2024. My name's Michael Burge. I'm here to host this morning's session on bush justice with these three wonderful ladies. Welcome also to those joining us online in this session throughout New South Wales. People are watching at their local libraries and including my local library in Glen Innes region, so hello home. It's lovely to have you all here watching us. Before we kick off, of course, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of this land, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. As I said, I'm Michael Burge, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Metcalfe Auditorium today to interview and have a panel discussion with authors Kate Holden, up the end, Danuka McKenzie down by me, and of course Jamelle Wells. You'll all recognise her from the television. Please welcome them all here today. Now, before we start, just a couple of housekeeping comments to make. Please remember to mute your mobile phones and don't record the session, please. If you're taking photographs, that's fine, but please make sure you've got your flash off. We'd love it if you could please share any comments and posts on social media. You can tag us on Facebook and Instagram with the handle @BadCrimeSydney. And the hashtag that we're using is hashtag #BadCrimeSydney on Twitter or X, depending on what you want to call it. So that you can hear more of the panel sessions this year for all of the sessions that we're having over the next few days, the Bad Sydney Festival is trialling not having questions from the audience. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want you to interact with the authors that are here as part of the festivals here, but we have had feedback from previous festivals that the content of the panel itself that you very kindly paid to come along to is rather cut short by the section about question and answer from people. But after the session today, our speakers, our authors, will be outside in the bookshop area signing copies of their books, which we encourage you to purchase. I'm going to remind you of this, Christmas is coming. And as Sheila said last year, nobody wants wine and chocolates for Christmas.
I do.
Do you? There we go. No books for Kate, but no one wants them. No one wants alcohol for Christmas. We all want books. You'll get a much better experience out of a book than a bottle of gin, I reckon. So afterwards, yes, speakers will be available outside signing their books, and if you've got questions about what they're talking about today, that's the time to approach them to have a chat, and I encourage you to do so. Now, without further ado, let me introduce these fantastic authors to you. Jamelle Wells. Jamelle has been an ABC television and radio journalist and newsreader for over 20 years and senior court reporter for New South Wales. She's covered some of Australia's highest profile cases, including the ICAC inquiries into the former New South Wales Labor government ministers, the Gordon Wood, Kelly Lane and Jeffrey Gillam murder trials. She's the author of The Court Reporter and a kind of sequel to that, which we're talking about today, The Outback Court Reporter. They're both published by ABC Books, and Jamelle is also a Cobar girl. Welcome, Jamelle.
Thank you.
Now, you haven't travelled from Cobar today, have you? You actually live in Sydney?
No, I live in Sydney. I moved away from Cobar when I finished school. I went to school there. There were about maybe 8 people doing the HSC with me there, and I moved to the city to pursue work and my career. But as I age, I love getting out of Sydney and going bush again. And for this latest book, I did a judicial road trip around Australia. So I went around New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and it took me just under 2 years to do that. And after the book came out, people started ringing up and emailing me and saying, "You didn't come to my court, you didn't come to our court." So I think maybe another road trip is in order.
Wonderful. That sounds great. Kate Holden. Welcome, Kate. Kate is the author of In My Skin, a memoir, and The Romantic, Italian Nights and Days, both published by Text. For 6 years, she wrote a column for The Age and has published essays, short stories and reviews in The Griffith Review, Meanjin, The Weekend Australian, The Saturday Paper and plenty of others. Now, her most recent book is The Winter Road, which was the winner of the Walkley Book Award, and a detailed account of the shooting of Environmental Officer Glenn Turner at Cropper Creek, New South Wales in 2014. It's published by Black Ink Books. Please, I forgot to get you to hold your book up, Jamelle. Please hold them up for us. because this is a fantastic new edition of The Winter Road. How long has that one been out, Kate?
Foggy. 2021 it came out, yes.
Was that after it won the Walkley Book Award?
Oh, well, the book originally came out 2021. This, I think, came out a year later.
Right.
Yes, they got to, I don't mean to boast, but look, they got to put the little
medallions on the front. Congratulations. It's a fantastic read.
Thank you.
And Danuka Mackenzie, just to my left. Danuka is the winner of the 2020 Banjo Prize, and her writing has been longlisted for the Richel Prize. Is that how you say it? Richel?
I think
Richel. The Richel Awards, the Richel Prize, and highly commended in the Australian Crime Writers Association Louis Award. Before turning to writing full-time, Danuka worked in the environmental sector. She now volunteers as part of the team behind the Writers Unleashed Festival, and she's author of the Detective Kate Miles crime fiction series, of which Tipping Point, that's your cue, Tipping Point is the third and latest instalment, and the books are published by HarperCollins. Welcome them again, please. Now, we've pitched this session as something of a rodeo, but I don't have a stock whip. I do know how to crack a stock whip. I don't actually own one. I was taught when I was a kid by my grandfather. But we're here to talk about justice, which I think I chose the term rodeo because a rodeo is pretty chaotic. It's full of potential injuries. It's full of risk. The outcome is never really that great for anyone that's involved, although I'm sure people that love camp drafting and rodeo would argue with me, but therein lies another issue about rodeos. But this term justice is something that we'll be discussing from different angles across today's session. But first, I'd like to start with talking about your book, Kate, The Winter Road. I've just taken a little statement from the back of the book to give us to catch us up on what this book actually aims at doing and what it achieves. So July 2014, a lonely road at twilight outside Cropper Creek, New South Wales. 80-year-old farmer Ian Turnbull takes out a firearm and shoots Environmental Officer Glenn Turner in the back. On one side, a farmer hoping to secure his family's wealth on the richest agricultural soil in the country. On the other, his obsession, the government man trying to apply environmental laws. It is the story of Australia. Now, Kate, the first question I have is how do you even start to write a book that has a tag like that, the story of Australia?
Well, I should confess that I didn't come up with the idea for this book. I was approached by a publisher, so I was handed this story and with almost no guidance about what they expected. But they'd had an article written for the Saturday paper which covered this crime, which had happened a few years earlier. And they thought there was a book in it. So they approached me, who had no experience whatsoever in writing about crime, about history, about Australian ecology. I didn't live in the countryside. I live in Melbourne then. And for some reason they thought I would be the one, I suppose because I knew nothing at all. So they gave me this scenario, and the events had already taken place, so I wasn't on the ground. Like I wasn't like Chloe Hooper going to Palm Island to see people, in the process of the event, or Helen Garner going to sit in on courts. I was really a latecomer, and everything had already been done. The man who had done the crime had already been tried, convicted, and died in jail. And Glenn Turner had been unfortunately dead for several years. So I was given this scenario, basically. A man shoots another one on the road, and it was apparently about land clearing, which didn't mean much to me. I didn't know much about land clearing as a sexy topic for a book. But what I saw almost instantly was that there were these two figures, and in my mind's eye, I guess I pictured them standing on this road, and I knew it had happened at twilight in wintertime, and that it would have been dusk and dark, and there was a bit of a gothic frisson to that, I suppose. But I thought, why were each of them there? There was this man and farmer who had everything that he wanted. He had all these estates. He had his kids set up on them. He was a millionaire. He was, nearing the end of his farming career. And then there's this man, Glenn Turner, who seemed like a nice guy, and he's about to be killed. For what? Why would you shoot an unarmed man in a twilight road miles away from everyone? And so I instantly started looking at where these two men had come from and saw that, in a way, they weren't important themselves. I mean, I wanted to respect both of them as I wrote the book and look into their stories and make them individuals. But what I saw was that each one was a kind of a representative of a much bigger and deeper story. And then as soon as I started looking into those stories, why was there a farmer who was able to make so much money on this land? Whose land? What land? Why? You know, how? And why was there such a thing as an environmental officer? You know, how long have we had these? Why is the government both supporting property rights and environmental regulation? What kind of a guy does this job? And then as soon as I saw those, I saw that there was a long kind of cascade of histories and cultural histories and technical histories that came behind it. And before that, there was all the arriving in Australia and settlement. Before there was philosophy. So as you can see, I just completely lost my mind and just went barreling backwards into this chasm of research. And what I found was when I'd written the book, we had to, you know, devise something for the blurb, and it all kind of came back to me that that's really what it was. It was this one man who felt that his land was worth killing for, and the other man who was representing the nation of Australia saying, don't do what you're doing, and who paid the price of his life. So it was a fantastic parable which fell into my hands.
Now, as you've explained, at the core of the story is a crime, you know, a killing. Did you need to prepare yourself to write about this? It had happened a few years before you sat down to write. It's at a great distance from you where you lived, and you know, all of us in some ways in and around a crime writing festival, we're sort of skirting around crime scenes, true or fictional. So here was a true one that you had to, in essence, investigate the motivation. Did you have to prepare yourself, and did you find it confronting?
I did, and especially because this was obviously a real event. So, I mean, I went from being very naive about it and thinking, oh, well, I'll find out about this murder. But in my research, of course, I ended up reading the court documents, and I read the very harrowing testimony of Glenn Turner's colleague, who was a witness, whose own life was threatened by the farmer. He felt a bullet sing past his head, you know. And his testimony was just so devastating to read, and I really tried to use as much of his own words, so I tried to put that power on the page. But I really came to grieve for Glenn Turner more and more as I wrote it. I'm not a great crime reader, to be honest. I read crime more when I was younger, and I had a small child, and I was a bit averse to reading about yucky, violent things at that moment. But there I was writing about this poor man bleeding out on the road, and I think it was good. It stiffened the spine of my resolve to write the book and to try and write it really conscientiously, because I thought it's not just some story that I'm writing. I'm not interviewing an artist for the newspaper, which is what I often do. This is something else. And I think when you're writing about, you know, victims and perpetrators and all of their families and all the rest of the people, I had to constantly be aware that they were real people and they were going to be reading it. You know, they might come to a writers' festival that I was appearing at. They would feel something, whatever I wrote. So it was a weighty responsibility, and I had to negotiate the kind of the truth of the violence against the feelings about how horrible it was. Yeah.
Now, Jamel, with the Outback Court Reporter, this is also taken from the blurb on the back of the book, just to remind us what it's about. From the grand sandstone edifices of Cobar and Grafton to the repurposed community halls and police stations in the Outback, Jamel takes us into our country courtrooms and introduces us to the solicitors, prosecutors, magistrates, witnesses and the accused in cases that shock, captivate and divide communities. It's also a timely reminder of the need for reform as country magistrates struggle with massive caseloads and limited resources, the fallout of failing regional health systems and limited bail and sentencing options in a justice system that is under pressure and communities still disadvantaged by the vastness of our continent. So how did you fit all this into one book, Jamel?
On the judicial road trip, I had specific people I wanted to talk to. I'd read newspaper articles about different magistrates and prosecutors, and I'd heard from my court contacts covering city courts about people who were doing good things in country towns and about things that were going horribly wrong. And having grown up in the country and travelling to the bush a lot, I'm really aware of the difference in resourcing. And I'd sort of had the idea that Australia might be a country where justice is by postcode. And that judicial road trip reaffirmed that in many, many ways. I had specific courts I wanted to go to, people I wanted to talk to. There were stories I had done for the ABC. I had chosen issues and themes in the country justice system and travelled there to do those stories, so I expanded on those. I expanded on the stories of a lot of my colleagues, and then I just randomly dropped into courthouses. I would drive to a town, I would look up the court list, because in a lot of country towns, court sits once a month. It's not like in Sydney where there's something on at the Downing Centre or Central Local or the other courts around the city every day. And so I would find out when court was sitting and I would just walk into the courtroom. And that had mixed results. Some people did not want me in the courtroom because in a lot of remote towns they're not used to having the media scrutinise what they do. A lot of people welcomed me in the courtroom. The magistrates were over the moon that someone actually cared about what they were doing and some of the problems they were facing doing their job. And a lot of it was very, very random. I just came across stories that would not make their way into a city courtroom, but they were given lots of airtime in country courthouses. And for me, why I've done courts for over 2 decades is because for me a court shows you every aspect of humanity. You see people at their very worst, at their very best. There's a gamut of emotions. There's always high drama. And you're dealing with the future of people's lives. There are people making decisions about sentences for people who've committed crimes, and from young people to old people. And our justice system, we live in a democracy. It's meant to be a system of open justice, but you would be surprised how many people have never actually been into a courtroom and watched the process unfold, whereas we're allowed to. We're allowed to go into a public gallery of any court unless the court is closed by the judge or the magistrate. And I always urge people to do that because this is our justice system, and I think the spotlight needs to be put on it for all sorts of reasons.
Interesting. So I'm fascinated that, Janelle, you've been doing journalism long enough that you must have seen the word length, the average word length of articles diminish quite dramatically over that time. I've been in the game for just between 10 and 15 years, and it's gone from 1,200 down to 600, 700, 800 words. How do you fit... how do crafting a book where you get, I'm guessing, 80 to 100,000 words... How does that differ from reporting in those short sort of grabs on a story, particularly if you're only in town for a day or half a day?
So when you're doing a story for the news, be it radio or TV or online, it's usually TV and radio stories are usually only about, a TV story is about 1:30, radio is about 30 seconds. So when you're reporting on a court matter, you've got to nail what it's about in the first line and then just use the bare facts that actually tell the story. Expanding that, going around country towns and writing whole chapters for a book, just gave me the freedom to write about everything I saw, everything I heard, people I talked to, and record their conversations with their permission, think about their lives and why they may have been in court at all, think about what the magistrate said to them and why the magistrate imposed that sentence, and get in to the chapters a bit of flavour of country town life. And there's one chapter, the opening chapter in my book, that's actually set in my hometown, and it's in an IGA supermarket where a local fellow who worked there was charged with theft because he was accused of stealing a box of lollipops from the supermarket. And I randomly dropped into court that day, and when I heard the matter, I thought, this will take up about an hour of court time, it will all be sorted. That took up 2 days of court time, and all the staff who worked at the supermarket were witnesses, and they were being quizzed about whether, for example, they had seen Barista Brothers chocolate flavoured milk spontaneously explode and damage this box box of lollipops, and the magistrate was presented with CCTV vision of this guy in his black supermarket uniform walking out past the fruit and veg section with a trolley with the box of lollipops. And the Crown case was that he stole them, whereas he said the Barista Brothers chocolate-flavoured milk spontaneously exploded, damaged the lollipops, and so he was getting rid of damaged stock. Now, 2 days of court time was spent on that, so I was able to talk about things like some of the witnesses were people I'd gone to school with, so I was able to talk about them. I was able to talk about the visiting magistrate, the environment I grew up in, and even the crime scene, because the supermarket, right, when I was a kid growing up there, it wasn't a supermarket, it was an open-air picture theatre. So my mum and dad and I would get dressed up in our good clothes, and on a Friday and Saturday night we would go and watch the movies, because there wasn't a lot else to do in Cobar at that time, and we would drink these big cartons of sarsaparilla with ice cream in it from the cordial factory next door, owned by the same family who owned the picture theatre. And the young people of the town would sit up the front, and they had these canvas sort of slingback seats there, and they would, throw all the toilet rolls from the bathrooms in the air and let off firecrackers. And the good, respectable people like us would sort of sit up the back, and my mum would look at me, "Don't you grow up to be like that," And there was one usher who could keep this crowd up the front under control, and she was the daughter of the owner of the picture theatre, and she would go up and literally grab people by the collar and drag them outside, or she would whack them on the back of the head with a torch. So I was able to talk about things like that.
I told you it was a rodeo. Thank you, Jamel. Now, tipping point. It's also from the blurb. Weeks from Christmas, Detective Kate Miles' estranged brother, Luke Grayling, returns home to Esserton to farewell a childhood friend, dead by suicide. Within days of the funeral, another young man is found shot dead in the back paddock of his property. Almost 20 years ago, Luke and these men were best mates in high school, and now 2 of the 3 are dead. When Luke is identified as a person of interest in Marcus's death, Kate once again finds herself in the middle of a media storm, sidelined from the case and battling accusations of conflict of interest. Now, I want to know, where did this Detective Kate Miles come from in your mind, Danuka?
So Kate came to me when I had my own kids. So I, did the very traditional Sri Lankan daughter thing of getting an education and having a good job, and getting having a mortgage and having a family, all that stuff. And then I had my kids, and, I guess my identity up to that point had been very much built on, my job and, that career I had built up. And then suddenly I had my kids, and, I found myself in that place of trying to manage these two things, which both were incredibly demanding, but often had kind of conflicting expectations, And I was reflecting on the fact that a lot of the males in equivalent positions in my own, profession and just people I saw weren't as affected by the fact that when they had kids as sort of it seemed to affect me. And sort of I had all of those big emotions, feeling overwhelmed and a bit resentful and all of the things. And so that's when I started writing. So I just really wanted something just completely for myself, like just utterly selfishly for myself, where on the page of that laptop I was not a wife, a mother, a employee, a daughter. I wasn't any of that. I was just me, and I could do whatever I wanted on those pages. And so who turned up on the page was this woman who also had worked hard and built this career for herself and then had kids. And then she felt, and she was still ambitious for her career, although she was incredibly, obviously she loved her family very much, but she didn't feel like she needed to give up this career as other people, as equivalent males in her position would not be asked to do, and also would not be asked the sort of specific questions that she gets asked. So throughout the books, the books, this series starts when she's heavily pregnant, so the torrent starts when she's heavily pregnant. So I'm looking at those issues around this she's very heavily pregnant, she's doing her job, and kind of the intrusive kind of questions that get asked from her, both from her colleagues, but also, I guess, the people she has to meet while she's off doing her cases. In the second book, I explore kind of that very new motherhood where she's essentially going to work with leaking breasts and, and also having to deal with a case of a young child going missing. So it's very much, in the, as a crime writer does, you kind of push that envelope as far as it can go, because what's her vulnerability? She's a new mum, so of course she has a case involving a young child going missing. And then this tipping point is really taking that further and going, okay, she really has got to a point where she has to, her loyalties between her police family and her real family are tested. So I'm sort of taking that further on, and because this case is very much based on having her brother suddenly embroiled in a case involving a murder, and she has to really look at, this idea of siblings who you grew up with, and then suddenly they've become this adult who you can't recognise, or you suddenly get a bit of information about this adult person who you knew as a child, and how do you kind of incorporate that new piece of information about them, and this person, this person that you still love, where does that love go, even though you suddenly hear some information about them that is not necessarily good. So she is again having to navigate this loyalty between kind of the police force and her family, and sort of going back to, I think, what you said, Jamel, about this idea in the news. Often we as the public meet kind of offenders and perpetrators through the news, and it's often just through a headline, and we're immediately judging that person or how they got to that point. And what's always interested me in crime fiction, and what has kind of is the drive, I guess what underpins my writing is trying to unravel that and go back to, well, how did they get to that point? And who was responsible? Was it just themselves, or was there a whole group of people involved who actually did stuff or actually didn't do stuff? Both those things matter, and all the things that happen which don't necessarily meet the definition of a crime under the law, but still influence that outcome, and obviously, and the circumstances and those bigger pressures, and those larger inequalities that has also kind of affected that decision. So I'm interested in all of that, and that's kind of how it came about.
That's great. So, but everything you've described, which is fascinating and very apt for crime fiction, and it has hallmarks with true crime, everything could be in any setting. It could be an urban or a suburban or a metro setting, but you chose to set it in the bush. Now, I've looked on a map for Essendon and I can't find it, but there are clues throughout the 3 books about where this is. Why did you decide to set it in the Northern Rivers, and did you have a background there, or you decided to go somewhere which you thought was just so far away from your regular life? Where was that motivation from?
Yeah, so Essendon, so it's, yes, as you say, it is very much a fictional town. But the Northern Rivers location really came about as a result of the plot for the first book in the series, which was The Torrent. And I needed a place where a big river flood would happen. And really, since I had come to Australia in 92, I had really only experienced Australia in severe droughts through the Millennium Drought and everything. And so then the 2010-11 floods of the Northern Rivers and kind of the Brisbane River flooding, that was really my first experience of seeing Australia in those huge floods. And so those images really stayed with me when I was thinking about sort of, years later when I was thinking about writing, and that kind of idea came to me of what if there's a crime during a sort of an emergency situation, because where everyone else is distracted and obviously you're focused on something else. So, so that was kind of the seed of the idea for The Torrent. And then I had done kind of work in that region, in that kind of border region, and so that's how that location came about. And so, yes, it is connected. It is in that area of kind of Murwillumbah and the Tweed River and all of that. And, of course, then had to obviously travel up there to do the research for, to do the fact-checking and everything. And then obviously later I was like, oh, why have I chosen this location? It's like a 10-hour drive. Every single time I do a new book, I have to like do this huge drive to like do the fact checking. So, maybe it wasn't the best decision, but it's actually been good in the sense that, particularly sort of it's, like for crime fiction readers and particularly overseas readers, they have this one idea of Australia as this kind of outback. We are outback, and of course it's not the case. And for most of us, actually, we are probably living in the kind of the coastal fringe and are probably more familiar with the coastal, those landscapes rather than that full red earth outback. So, I think it's good, just as we as an audience are completely capable of reading about US and the UK and all its different landscapes. It's good to have kind of these, this much more, much more diverse view of Australia as different landscapes, because that's obviously what it is.
Absolutely, and it's done so beautifully. I think it's great. I think there's not that many books or pieces of fiction, crime fiction, about regions like the Northern Rivers. I just think you've done a magnificent job with it, and great to hear that you visit. Wonderful. Now, Jamel, when I was doing a bit of reading up about the coverage that you've done over the years, in the first Google search that I did, an image popped up, and it was of a woman holding a protest sign, and it said "Death by Postcode." It was in the ABC News coverage about this inquiry into rural, regional and remote healthcare. Now, this is something that those of us who live in the bush, we talk about a lot. We care about it intensely. I just wanted to capture your thoughts about that slogan, "Death by Postcode."
Very, very real for me, and there is a whole chapter in the book about a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry into regional health, and that is my father's legacy. I pushed for that inquiry after the death of my father, who received appalling treatment in 2 regional hospitals, and that it still haunts me. What happened to him? He fell over at home. He was 85, broke his hip, was flown from his hometown of Cobar to Dubbo Base Hospital for emergency surgery. The first surgery went wrong. They did a second surgery, couldn't find out where it went wrong. They tried to discharge him. He went into cardiac arrest, and although he had a very clear resuscitation plan in place, they didn't want to resuscitate him because of his age. The hospital ran out of Panadol, morphine. After he survived resuscitation with full mental capacity, he had to go without food and water for 3 days because it was a long weekend, and the hospital said they couldn't roster anyone on to do what's called a SIP test to see if he could eat and drink safely. It was a litany of things, and he was discharged overnight, even though he was very sick, sent back to Cobar Hospital, wasn't allowed to stay there, was booted out to a nursing home on Melbourne Cup Day, and held my arm as he was crying and said, "No one wants to look after me anymore." My father died thinking he wasn't worthy of a hospital bed. When I spoke out about this to the media, a colleague, Liz Hayes, also spoke out about the death of her father, Brian, in similar circumstances in regional health. And she did a story on 60 Minutes. Hundreds of country people came forward and with similar stories of bad experiences in regional health. We pushed really hard for the parliamentary inquiry. It sat for just over a year in places like RSL auditoriums and community halls all around the state, and some of the evidence was quite shocking. The findings, when they were handed down, were scathing. They were that the life expectancy in most country towns in New South Wales is going backwards, that staff are working in a culture of fear, and that people are denied basic things like antibiotics. There are brand new shiny hospitals with no doctor in them. There are towns that haven't had a doctor for years, and the inquiry made a swag of recommendations about how things could improve. A few years later, it's my opinion, not much has improved at all. It's still a problem for governance.
I was going to ask you about your thoughts about that, because I was hunting for some follow-up reports, but they seem very thin on the ground. But some of the most visceral reactions I think I've ever had to a book that we could classes in the category of truth and factual reporting, like your book, were to those passages, particularly about your father. And I'm very, very sorry to hear that that was your experience and his experience, and that he died with those feelings. If it's okay for you to talk about that more, you described them as bad experiences and bad conditions, but is this borderline government criminality in your view?
I think it's borderline government neglect. And what I found was that for someone my dad's age, there was a presumption against life for him from the start, from the moment he was admitted to hospital. It was like, he's old, he's on his way out. You know, we don't want to resuscitate him, we don't want to do this, boot him out to the nursing home, even though he was critically unwell. It really disturbed me. When my dad was in hospital, we had so little faith in his care. We were sleeping at the hospital 24/7 with him. We were worried about what might happen to him. And I picked up a local newspaper in Dubbo just after my dad died, and although the area health service couldn't afford to roster someone on or to come in and help my dad on a long weekend, they had on the front page of the local newspaper that the hospital had just spent $30 million on a new car park. So there was the minister at the time and hospital officials proudly, and I thought, you felt so that a human life was worth not much, but you thought you could spend all this money on a car park. That was really, really upsetting. And my story was not isolated. I still get phone calls and emails from people in the country on the strength of that inquiry and the evidence that Liz Hayes and I gave, and we feel a bit of a responsibility to keep trying to push for improvements, but we're not quite sure where to go next. It's very hard. What I do know is that a lot of country people are too scared to speak up, and I think governments and bureaucrats take advantage of that. It's out of sight, out of mind. They're not going to kick up a fuss because they're in the bush. They pay the same taxes, but we're not going to spend the money, that we could out there. No one expects to have open heart surgery in a country hospital, but things like a GP or antibiotics are basic expectations, and some witnesses gave evidence to the inquiry that there were none of those things in their local hospitals. Here we think, oh, it's awful, we had to wait a day to get in and see our regular GP. Some people in the bush wait for months, and some GPs just have a closed patient list. They won't take on any more. It's very closely linked, I think, to the justice system in many ways, because in courts in the bush, I saw a lot of magistrates saying to people like drug offenders, people with mental health illnesses, go see a GP, get a mental health plan, go and get some rehab. But some of the offenders would just look at the magistrate and go, I've been trying to see a GP for months, I can't. And in terms of sentencing options, in the bush, magistrates are very limited because the nearest drug rehab program might be 9 or 10 hours drive away. So a 19-year-old is not going to drive 9 or 10 hours and then live away from their family and their support base to get that rehab. It's just not practical. So that's just one way that it ties in with the justice system. I think regional health is really disturbing. I think it is an us and them situation. And a lot of whistleblower staff came forward as well. A lot of doctors and nurses came forward and spoke to us anonymously, spoke to the inquiry, some on the record. And what was really disturbing about all of this is that there were efforts all along for us not to speak up. After I spoke to the Sydney Morning Herald, the minister at the time, the health minister in New South Wales, ordered a clinical review of my experiences and the experiences of a handful of other people. And I went along and spoke to a review panel, and they assured me that all of my input would be included in their report to the minister. But a couple of weeks later, I got an email on a Friday afternoon, which is, when you get those emails, you know that someone trying to sort of bury it in the news cycle so that it won't make any weekend, or it'll make a weekend story, but not many people will read it. And it said, sorry, we missed the deadline with your evidence. It won't be going to the minister, but you can talk with us privately at any time. And at first, I was gutted because I thought, my father's dead. These other people, one man had lost his toe, one man had lost his bowel, one man had other permanent injuries because of appalling regional health. But my dad was dead, and I thought, someone has to speak up for him. He has to have a voice. So that made me even more determined to speak out, and it was hard doing that.
You pay great tribute to him, and I do commend that part of Jamel's book to readers, in addition to the rest of the content of the book itself. But it's almost like it deserves a book on its own. But that's probably for a conversation for another time. But thank you for sharing his story in the book and also with us today, Jamel. Now, Kate, as I noticed in the media quite recently, it's now 10 years since the shooting of Glenn Turner at Cropper Creek. 10 years on, how do you feel about the research and the writing processes that you went through over that decade, and how do you reflect on that milestone?
I wish I'd known you, Jamel, because you could have helped me work out what I was doing. I had no journalistic training in how to research true crime. Yes, I realised the other day it was 10 years. I sent a message to Glenn Turner's widow, Alison Mackenzie, and she said that her family's doing well, which was good to hear. But, this book that I wrote, most of the people who've read it who've given me feedback say, look, it's a really big book and it's really sad. And I thought, yes, it's a sad story. It's a story of several murders. So there's the murder of Glenn Turner, there's the murder of the native ecology, and at the back of that there's the killing of First Nations people on the same land. And that's all sad enough. But then to reflect that 10 years after Glenn Turner lost his life because Ian Turnbull didn't like being prosecuted for land clearing, the laws are still in place, which mean that Ian Turnbull's clearing would now be legal, where he took two blocks, or he and his family took 2 blocks of completely untouched, relatively untouched, but endangered species that they knew they would never get permission to clear, and cleared them ruthlessly and relentlessly through a whole process of prosecution, investigation and conviction and fines and orders to remediate. And they just did not do anything. They cleared every bit of it, made millions of dollars, and then sold those properties, even though they were still under legal requirements. And 10 years later, I don't see any signs that anything like that would be different now. Ian Turnbull became a kind of poster boy for, I know this is a little bit tedious, but native vegetation law regulations. And it was widely seen to be a failure of the process, that there wasn't enough staff, the staff weren't properly trained, etc., etc. There was a review into the Environmental Protections Act in the federal level. That's still going on. There was a change of government, so that the laws, the native vegetation laws of New South Wales might have changed. They haven't been changed. There's no appetite, as I can tell, that they will be changed. So basically, we're left with these really faulty laws for which Glenn Turner gave his life to have passed, and that was the exact opposite of what he was charged with doing. So researching all of this was completely deranging. I had to start from the start. Nothing. I'm not a crime reporter. I'm not any reporter. And I just waded in. And like I said, I got completely, attracted to all the historical research and all the rest of that as well. And I was reading convict memoirs, and I was reading First Nations accounts of atrocities, and I was reading Enlightenment philosophy, But I really also had to dig into the legal part of this this story. And as I was writing it, and we were in the very complicated editorial process where we're editing this massive monster of a manuscript, the story was still unfolding because the Turnbull prosecutions were still occurring because they'd successfully had a lot of them deferred. So they were still coming through the courts. In fact, one of them is still not concluded, as far as I know. And the kind of the regulations were changing, the politics around that were changing, the question of who was able to speak was changing. So I delivered my editors a 180,000 word manuscript, this absolute beast, and they, blanched, and we tried hacking it down, but the whole time I was hacking it down, I had to add all these extra bits as well. So I was, trying to keep track of 1,000 different court documents, and I really do wish I'd had your expertise, because you could have told me how to even find them. I was a rookie, so I discovered there's a lot of stuff on the internet, but even that, it was actually very obscure, and I realised that I had assumed that as a It wasn't a closed court, and that all of the archival material would be available to me, that everything would just be there and I could go to some kind of legal library and look it up. But this is not the case. It was closed. The boxes were closed. Someone had to go through and approve certain documents that I would be allowed to see. They were very partial, like only a fraction. And then the kind of online delivery of legal archives is extremely haphazard, and I had 1,000 different tabs open on my browser because I could never afford to lose any of these tabs because I'd never find that thing again, and I had to constantly refer to it. So I have 1,000 million things in my bibliography, and all I can do is hope that they're all correct because I learned on the job.
Wonderful. Well, would you mind reading us a part of your wonderful book, please, Kate?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing from the others too. We were just discussing as we got seated whether we should go for blood and gore or philosophy, and I think I got the blood and gore bit, which is there's not that much of it in my book. There's a lot more philosophy, but I'll just read you from the prologue, which sets the scene, and I hope it's not upsetting because it is about a real person. The crunch of the ute's tyres down the road. Excuse me, the sound of his breathing, his heart, he thought it would kill him, and his mouth was that dry. He had hoped the dark would hasten for cover. He'd been watching it coming, the dusk soaking down the trees, the shadows dissolving. They might make it if only the winter dark could arrive. Robert Strange had heard the fear in Glenn Turner's voice there in the shadows, crouched behind the ute. But he's also feared the dark because as it rose to hide them, Turnbull's gun would begin to hurry. They were on Talga Lane, a broad dirt groove in the farming country heading east-west in the flatlands between Moree and Cropper Creek in northwest New South Wales. The road went straight to the horizon, lined with scrub on either side, and to the left and right, occasional properties, palisades of vegetation, and enormous quilts of cleared, cropped land. It was just before 6 o'clock, knock-off time, nearly tea time. The road had been empty for the last 40 minutes. Just Strange and Turner and Ian Turnbull, the two white utes, the brigalow scrub, the koalas and other little animals keeping quiet, the cloudless sky slowly lifting into the night. Then the raised gun, the quiet, urgent voices, the shots, the pleas. Now Turnbull's rasping voice was gone and Turner's panicked breath was gone, and Strange could stop talking, stop this mad monologue to Turnbull holding the .22, saying, "We're unarmed, we're not here to hurt you, sir. Please put the gun down." And to Turner, "Stay down, Glenn. Move up a little bit. Glenn, move up, move. He's coming." His mouth so dry he could barely get the words out, and he needed to keep talking. There had been 6 explosions from the mouth of the gun. In the silence afterwards, Turnbull's red taillights had grown small. The dark came down like a door, only a little light in the sky to the west. The tall scrub, the black grass, the man now lying on the earth with his head towards the trees. Such hush. Strange got in their ute and turned the engine, trundling off the road to shine the headlights on the fallen man. He kneeled next to Turner, who was still breathing faintly. He got some water out of the car, took a mouthful, and poured some over Turner. He talked to him. He said they were both going to be okay. Weak pulse. He rubbed Turner's head. He poured more water over the man's face. The water glistened in the white light. Turner, trees above him, earth beneath, receiving his blood. Strange holding Turner. The men were bathed in a channel of light that bled across the rough grass. Behind the scrub, the fields, and the huge sky. Strange heard a vehicle approaching. He thought, "He's coming back. I've got no service and he's coming back. Hang in there, Glenn." He let go of Turner. He ran out onto the road. If it wasn't help, he didn't want to see what was going to happen. In the winter dark, on the winter road, he closed his eyes. The car slowed. A solid young man behind the wheel staring at him. The man stopped, backed up. Strange said his colleague had been shot. Andrew Ubergang rang 000 on his phone. He said to Strange, "You have to talk, I can't talk." Handed the phone over with a shaking hand. Strange got into Ubergang's white ute to explain and give directions. Far away in Dubbo, Strange and Turner's boss at the Office of Environment and Heritage, Arthur Snook, was getting a call that Turner's emergency position indicating radio beacon, the EPIRB, had been activated. He tried Turner's phone, he tried Strange's, tried again. Strange's phone came to life. "Arthur, is that you? Arthur, Glenn's been shot, chase the ambulance, he's bleeding badly." "Where are you?" Snook shouted down the line. Talga Lane. The call dropped out. The ute driver said he'd go for help. His white lights swung away. Strange went back out to Turner. He pulled him to a sitting position, cradling his head. Blood came out of Turner's mouth, shining in the cold light of the headlights. He wasn't breathing. Strange dropped him, pressed his big hands against Turner's chest, pumped. Come on, Glenn, you can't do this. We've got to get home. And he realised that Glenn was dead.
Thank you, Kate. It's as challenging as it is to be aware of the knowledge of that crime. I think you've shown it's a beautiful nexus between true crime writing and fiction writing, because you really have injected that with so much emotion, which I think is I think it's one of the hardest things to do as a writer, is to capture that emotion.
Well, I based almost every line on Robert Strange's testimony. I tried very hard not to invent things, because I really had to respect the situation. But he had given this very vivid description, and he'd also done a walkthrough for police video. And so between that and me going out to Talga Lane and seeing the place itself, and then I actually even researched the weather that day to see what time it got dark and if it was cloudy. So I tried to really put myself there and think how it would be. And I came as knowing that there had been a murder, but of course no one in the story knew there was going to be a murder until it happened.
Yeah, well done. Jamel, would you please share something of your book for us?
Yes, we decided that I should do something lighter. So,
Good move.
some of the chapters in this book, as I mentioned, were written after I just randomly dropped into courtrooms, and one of those was Foster. Who's been to Foster here? Yeah, okay. On the Mid-North Coast, I was on the way back from the William Tyrrell inquest, the little boy in the Spider-Man suit who disappeared while in foster care, and that was in Taree. And I'd never been to Foster Court, so I had a friend travelling with me and we dropped into Foster. And this is a little bit of what happened. The courtroom in Foster had seating for only around 12 people in the public gallery, which was right up close to the visiting magistrate, Ross Hudson. We found seats and settled in for the 2 hours or so until the lunch break. Magistrate Hudson was very efficiently ploughing through the list, at times speaking very quickly and slapping each file down on the bench with emphasis after he'd finished with it. He was well prepared and seemed to have read all the material in front of him before coming to court, something country magistrates don't always get time to do with a long list. A tall, thin man sitting next to us, wearing army-style khaki shorts with a tattoo down the back of his leg, was called up. The 21-year-old told the magistrate he was representing himself and pleaded guilty to shoplifting. A month earlier, he had stolen a cat flap from Bunnings at Foster, then showed his photo ID at the front counter, claiming he'd paid for the door but requesting a $150 cash refund because it was unsuitable. The man told the court he was unemployed and self-medicated with cannabis for his depression, which was why he needed the cash. Magistrate Hudson said although the shoplifting was below the mid-serious range of offending, it had to stop, and the man needed to do something about his drug problem. You need to be drug-free, because if you're drug-free, you will be crime-free. You have to make the effort, because good mental health can't be just switched on and off. He fined the man $100 and told him to access drug support services. A man then called up for a bail variation was not in court, and his solicitor said he'd seen him in the foyer earlier, but he must have gone home. Magistrate Hudson sighed and gave the solicitor a fortnight to get his client to return. And make sure he wears his best shirt next time, he added. 5 people in succession listed for bail variation hearings did not turn up, and another man sent a fax to court saying he'd be late because he had an issue with his teeth. He'll show up, he always does in the end, said the magistrate, suggesting that he knew the man as a repeat offender. A 19-year-old man was then given a good behaviour bond for using his phone to menace his ex-partner, along with a very stern dressing down by the magistrate. I'm not being sexist, but there's nothing worse than angry young men in the community because they unravel quickly. You won't survive in custody, so don't tempt the court to send you to jail, Magistrate Hudson said. After the court lunch break, we settled back into our seats and the prosecutor and magistrate resumed going through matters on the list. Suddenly, Magistrate Hudson looked up from the bench and straight at me. "Madam, can you please stop typing in court?" I was stunned. Having worked in courts for almost 2 decades, I have never been asked not to type because reporters rely on having iPads, iPhones or laptops in court to work on. The Foster courtroom was very small, however, and I was sitting so close to the magistrate I assumed that tapping on my iPad might have seemed annoyingly louder than in a bigger court, so I apologised and stopped. I closed the iPad, rested a notebook on it and started writing in the notebook with a pen. A few minutes later, Magistrate Hudson looked at me again. I said, "Stop typing on the iPad." He snapped, and at the same time, a court sheriff lunged across 2 rows of seats in my direction. I held up the notebook and started to say, "Your Honour, I am not typing on the iPad," but Magistrate Hudson didn't listen and kept talking over the top of me. "Get out of court. Go outside now." My friend, Robin, looked mortified as the court sheriff escorted me out and everyone else in the public gallery turned around. Outside, the sheriff lectured me about not being allowed to type or write in court. We argued the point for a few minutes until, out of exasperation, I Googled my ABC biography on my iPad and held it up for him to read. "Look, this is who I am and I'll apologise to the magistrate, but I know I am allowed to write in court." I also Googled an exclusive interview I'd recently done with the Chief Magistrate and showed that to the sheriff, who stopped talking and went very quiet. He took my iPad off me and said, "I'll see what I can do," before going back into the courtroom. My dramatic exit and loud conversation with the sheriff had meanwhile attracted the attention of those gathered in the foyer, waiting for their court matters to be heard, and a few rallied around. My friend Robin came out of the courtroom and watched from a short distance, highly amused. "Did you just get chucked out?" smirked a young man wearing floral board shorts, thongs and a baseball cap. "Oh, that's so cool. What did you do?" He looked disappointed when I told him it was only for writing on paper with a pen. "Aren't you that court lady from the ABC?" a neatly dressed woman sitting next to her son asked. She seemed more articulate than some of the others, and as we chatted, she told me she was a local school teacher. "You shouldn't get kicked out for that. So much for democracy. First the Afghan file raids on the ABC, and now this." The woman was referring to the federal police raids on the ABC Ultimo studios a few months earlier after the reporting of allegations of war crimes by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. I was not in any way involved with the war crimes story or targeted by the raids, but this woman seemed to know all about them. She put her arm protectively around her son, who was in court to have his bail for an assault matter varied, and she straightened his shirt collar. He brushed her hand off and looked away, embarrassed. Another young local man with a Hawaiian print shirt and his hair in a ponytail was less articulate with his thoughts about me getting thrown out. "Far out, there effing dogs in there. Take your cameras in, love, and stick it up 'em." As I was trying to explain that cameras aren't allowed in a courtroom without special permission, and then usually only to film a judgment or sentence, the court door swung open and the sheriff beckoned me back in, handing back my iPad. Robin followed me, grinning from ear to ear with the drama of it all and amused by the new friends I'd made in the foyer. Magistrate Hudson said, "I'm very sorry for the confusion, madam. Please take a seat," then efficiently resumed working through the matters listed before him. Robert and I were glad we went back in because the next matter provided some welcome relief from the more serious cases with sad outcomes that we had listened to all day. A 79-year-old woman with short grey permed hair, the curls super tight and the sort I haven't seen since I was a child growing up in a country town, contested a fine for parking in a no-stopping zone near Salo's restaurant at the Taree Aquatic Club. The woman worked at the club and her solicitor said she thought the disabled parking sticker on her windscreen would offer her protection and produced a photo that explained why she parked where she did. The photo showed someone else had left very large garbage bins in the disabled spot next to the no-stopping zone. Magistrate Hudson dismissed the matter, noting that the woman had an excellent 60-year driving record. "I'm not being ageist, but your client might not be as mobile as she once was and it is at risk of falling," the magistrate said. "I've already had one fall," the woman said loudly from the front row. "Well, next time, find a car park that is legal, madam," the magistrate said. "Well, I've been promoted, so I can park in front of the office now, Your Honour," she replied. Magistrate Hudson smiled for the first time that day. Everyone else in the public gallery smiled too, and a man sitting next to us briefly applauded as the woman left the courtroom.
Thank you, Jarell. So you got into trouble a little bit.
Just a tad.
Thank you. Now, I'm aware that we've almost run to time, but I would, if you need to leave, please do, but please also consider staying a little bit extra to hear from Danuka. Would you mind reading the prologue? Yes. Because thank you. So from true crime to crime fiction.
Okay.
Thank you, Danuka.
So it's a very short prologue. A tiny furry creature scurries across the forest floor, its eyes attuned to the dark, its body pausing, quivering, testing the air for the scent of predators. There is no moon, and the trees knit together in an inky tangle of branches, leaves and roots. The night air is heavy with an endless summer heat, a thick, suffocating torpor that seems to be waiting for a flame to spark and engulf the whole. The bushland breathes and waits. The cracks that rang through the night air a minute ago have faded, the reverberations of sound absorbed into the atmosphere like it had never been. The cacophony of insect and nighttime critters have resumed, indifferent to the momentary interruptions of humans and their unfathomable deeds. On the ground, several metres away, a shape lies sprawled across the parched grass, slowly cooling and leaking, a new liquid joining the earth, iron red seeping into chocolate brown, blood and bone returning home.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end with the words of these three women. I think it's amazing how we're bookended here by prose which sounds almost as though it could be by the same mind and heart, bookended around true news reporting about crime in the bush. So thank you for joining us today. Don't forget you can meet these three women in the bookshop. I commend all of their works to you. Of course, Danuka's got 2 more books before this one, and Janelle's got 1 more. And there's a whole stack of other work by Kate Holan out there in the marketplace to pick up too. So please thank them again, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.